Nigel Farage, in an interview on GB News at the end of last week, referred to your quitting the party as being what he called a champagne moment. So, my question to you is: did you open a bottle of Bolly after you made your decision? Because it was your decision.
Yeah, I didn't open a bottle of Bolly. If people watch the video that I did on Thursday morning explaining my reasons for leaving, I start by saying I'm saddened. And I am very saddened because the rapid rise of reform, if I may be so um, self-promoting, at the risk of being self-promoting, the rapid rise of reform has, quite a bit to do with me. I was deputy leader and I helped put reform on the map. We went from 6% in the polls when I joined the party to 16% just before the general election. And I think we got 14% of the votes in the general election. But my leaving reform had nothing to do with, I think Nigel then went on GB News to say that I was bitter and I was bitter because he'd sacked me as deputy leader. My leaving reform was as a result of some historical issues which I can go into, including Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is at the core of one of the reasons I had to leave Reform, the Northern Ireland Protocol and Reform's position on Northern Ireland. But at the heart of it was the fact that Reform isn't a proper political party. It is a limited liability company. And there are, in fact, only two members. You talked about rapidly growing membership. Actually, the correct way to describe it would be rapidly growing subscribers. Because when you sign up to Reform, you pay your 25 quid and you get the right to receive an email. You don't get the right to vote on anything. Now, Nigel had promised to change this. He promised to change the company that is limited by shares and which he and Richard Tice own, to a company limited by guarantee, which would then be opened up to the subscribers, who would then become genuine members. He also promised to institute a constitution, which which we can go into in detail if you like. I don't think I think it's a bad document, but fundamentally, you can't convert a company limited by shares to one limited by guarantee. You would need to set up a new company. It's not legally possible to make that conversion. No new company has been set up. No new applications have been made to the Electoral Commission in the United Kingdom to register a new company in the way that Nigel promised he would do it. And the new constitution, such as it is, also hasn't had an application made to have it adopted by the Electoral Commission, approved by the Electoral Commission, and therefore capable of being implemented by the party. So he hasn't democratized the party. And I have serious doubts whether that will ever happen. And I don't think that it is intellectually or ideologically coherent to be making the case for the democratic unit that is the United Kingdom, banging the drum of the importance of the British people being able to direct those who lead the United Kingdom in their actions, but simultaneously saying, I'm not prepared to be directed by my membership. And so I'm controlling them. And I hope that in the fullness of time, I will be proven to be wrong, and that Nigel will democratize the party, that it will become a proper political party with proper members who can direct the leadership to some extent with the appropriate checks and balances in place to, follow the will of the membership. But at the moment, and from everything I've seen, including the misrepresentations made by Zayar Youssef on the subject and the misrepresentations made by Nigel, I'm not confident that will happen. But the final straw for me for leaving the party, Lee, was my being banned by the HQ of Reform from meeting grassroots members of so-called members, subscribers, promoters, campaigners across the country. And when I heard that I was being banned, I was being silenced, I thought, well, that enough is enough. If they don't want me to speak, if I'm not even allowed to speak to people in the party, then, it's time I left. So no doubt it was a champagne moment for Nigel, but it wasn't one for me.
Was it, in fact, the decision that you found that you were being banned from speaking? Because when I first approached you, you had an engagement today to speak to supporters of the party, did you not?
Yes, I should be in Runcorn at the moment.
Runcorn in Cheshire, exactly, which is our global audience. That's in the north of England, nice part of the world, and that's where you were going to be. And the only reason you're talking to us today is because you were stopped from
Yeah,
speaking uh, to the supporters of the party. So you were no longer able to go to that event. Is that correct?
absolutely correct. And I had half a dozen, if not more, such events lined up during the course of tail end of November, and December and January, and they've all been cancelled.
Right. And how were you informed?
I wasn't informed. There was no formal information passed to me. It's just that I was called by a couple of the organizers of these events and saying, sorry, we've had to cancel it. HQ says we're not allowed to have you. So I said, well, could you kindly get that confirmed by someone that I recognize in HQ? And Richard Tice confirmed it to them. So, once I got that confirmation, I knew that there's no room for me in the party. But, one of the just there was no room for me in the party. But one of the reasons I was at odds with Nigel, and I am at odds with Nigel on this, and with the party, is that Nigel is of the view that Brexit's done, and I'm of the view that you cannot have Brexit with Northern Ireland left in the European Union and with a border down the Irish Sea, because we voted for the United Kingdom to leave. Nigel is also of the view that a united Ireland, in other words, bringing Northern Ireland into the Republic, is inevitable. And I absolutely reject that inevitability. And some of the viewers on this chat, some of the participants on this chat, may recall that we had an alliance with the traditional unionist voice. And you heard from Jim Allister and Dan Boucher, who are of the TUV. When I say we, Reform UK had an alliance, which I brokered with Jim Allister, and we were going to fight together the general election. And during the course of the general election, Nigel endorsed Ian Paisley and Sammy Wilson of the DUP. And the DUP had done the dirty on Northern Ireland by coming up with the notion that the Irish Sea border somehow didn't exist because they'd got a promise of safeguarding the union from Rishi Sunak. And so when it was absolutely absurd to me that Nigel was endorsing candidates in Northern Ireland, which were standing against our allies in the traditional unionist voice. And so my decision to leave the party isn't one, as you rightly say, Lee, that was made in a knee-jerk reaction over a period of 24 hours. This has been long in the coming. Actually, I knew when Nigel came back as leader that there were going to be issues, because I already knew that he says Brexit's done and I say it's not done. And I wouldn't have joined Reform without the declaration from Richard Tice, who was then leader, which he put in writing, that Brexit isn't done. I agree with you, Ben, Brexit's not done, and we will continue to fight for Northern Ireland. And I got a declaration from Richard that we would fight for Northern Ireland. And that's all in a letter. And Nigel effectively repudiated that letter when he came back as leader, because he is of the view, and he can put me right if he wants to, he is of the view, he said it many times, that Brexit's done. And then he endorsed our opponents in the general election, contrary to the agreement I had with Richard and with Jim Allister. And that makes things very, very difficult, as I'm sure you appreciate, Lee.
Yeah. So Nigel's had a few fairly strong things to say about you in the last few days. You've maintained, from what I can see, a fairly dignified silence. But here is your opportunity to speak to Nigel direct. What would you like to say to him about what he said about you?
Well, he has said a couple of things about me. He said that I've attacked him personally. I haven't attacked Nigel personally. I challenge him to find any attacks I've made on him personally. Yes, I have attacked his position on Northern Ireland. I've attacked his position on Brexit. I've attacked his acceptance of the rapid demographic change in the country. I disagree with him on mass deportations. I think mass deportations should take place. And we've got some other ideological differences, and I disagree with him on the constitution of the party, seemingly. But it's not personal, and actually every party should be capable of having these discussions. He would argue that I've made it all very public, and I shouldn't have done that. But believe me, Lee, and everyone else on this chat, before I went public, there was a lot going on privately. And if you can't prevail privately, and you've got no mechanism to prevail, because actually Nigel and Richard own the party, the only way to do it is through the public domain where I've got a voice. And so I've been making the case for Brexit, for Northern Ireland, for the democratization of Reform UK in the public domain. He also said I'm bitter because he sacked me as deputy leader. I'm not bitter at all about being sacked as deputy leader. If Reform UK does democratize, if Reform UK can move forward as a proper political party, actually, I will absent myself from politics, because I don't really want to be in politics. I'm only in politics. I'm only got into politics to get Brexit done. And I've stayed in politics because I've discovered that Western civilization, including the United Kingdom, I think is facing an existential threat by this kind of liberal global order, which I'm kicking back against. But if Nigel can create out of Reform UK a party that can rescue the United Kingdom, then my job is done and I can leave. And I would gladly go back to my full-time day job, which is running a property company.
I think you've been handling this very eloquently, but also very honestly. And you mentioned how Nigel Farage said that you were bitter. Well, he actually went on to say that you're bitter and twisted, which is extraordinary. That's an extraordinary comment, especially from me sitting here in Australia and watching from afar. It almost makes him look bitter and twisted by saying that when you're being so eloquent about it. Why couldn't he have just wished you well and be done with it? Why does he have to attack you?
I don't know. I think he had a bad day. He'd also been cornered by Sky News over James McMurdoch earlier in the day. I don't know if you followed that story. And James McMurdoch is one of the 5 Reform UK MPs, and it now has come to light that he was jailed 20 years ago. We knew that he'd been jailed 20 years ago, but it's James McMurdoch had explained that he'd had an argument with his girlfriend, and he'd been arrested and jailed. It now came to light in the last 72 hours or so that he'd actually kicked his girlfriend while she was on the floor, and repeatedly kicked her. Apparently, I don't know. And Nigel was challenged during a press conference earlier in the day on James McMurdoch. And Nigel said, well, the vetting during the election was very poor. And of course, Nigel inadvertently, by saying the vetting was poor, inadvertently threw James McMurdoch under a bus, because, what he was implying was James McMurdoch wouldn't have made the cut. Are you with me? And then so Sky News went on to ask Nigel, well, if you were doing the vetting, would he now be an MP? And Nigel stormed off. And then I think so my leaving the party, that incident, and he'd hoped it would be a good day because he was announcing Andrea Jenkins joining the party. He was probably a bit pissed off. He was on Sky, he was on GB News, and Michelle Dewberry asked him, Michelle, who I like enormously and get on very well with, asked him, so what's going on with Ben? And I think he was like, well, I'll have a glass of champagne. I think that was a kind of knee-jerk reaction. Yeah.